In a peaceful park, a simple afternoon takes a shocking turn when a black woman finds herself wrongfully arrested by a racist officer. Tensions rise as the officer accuses her of breaking the law, but little does he know, he's about to make a huge mistake. As the situation escalates, the woman's calm demeanor hides a powerful secret, one that will leave the officer stunned. What happens next will make you question everything you think you know about authority, justice, and the power of standing your ground. But the twist is more than just a surprise. It's a moment of reckoning that no one saw coming. Stay tuned to find out how this encounter ends and what happens when a badge and a life collide in the most unexpected way. You won't believe how it all unfolds. The woman, Marissa, had come to the park for a quiet afternoon, seeking peace after a long week of work. She was enjoying the fresh air, reading a book by the lake when the officer approached her. He was new to the area, a young cop with a history of being quick to judge, especially when it came to people who didn't look like him. Without warning, he accused Marissa of loitering, even though she was clearly seated in a designated public space. Her calm response only seemed to irritate him more. He demanded her identification, his tone sharp and condescending. Marissa didn't flinch. She knew the law and how often people like her were unfairly targeted. But this time, she wasn't just another face. As the officer's frustration grew, Marissa took a deep breath and slowly reached into her bag, pulling out something that would change the entire course of their interaction. The officer had no idea what was coming next. As Marissa's fingers brushed the leather of her wallet, the officer's impatience began to crack through the surface. "Hurry up," he barked, his voice rising. Marissa remained unfazed, calmly flipping the wallet open. Her hand hovered over her badge, a small, simple emblem that held more weight than he could ever understand. She could feel the officer's eyes boring into her as she pulled it out, slowly placing it in his hand. At first, he just stared at the badge, his confusion obvious. It wasn't a typical civilian ID. His face twisted in disbelief, and his hand trembled ever so slightly as he glanced between the badge and her. For a split second, he hesitated. The shift in his expression wasn't lost on Marissa. She could see his mind racing. He'd just made a snap judgment, and now, the reality of his mistake was beginning to settle in. You're one of us," he stammered, his voice a mix of shock and embarrassment. Marissa didn't answer right away. She let the silence hang heavy, letting him stew in the weight of his mistake. She could tell he was trying to figure out how to backpedal, but every attempt only made him look more foolish. Meanwhile, other parkgoers, who had gathered around, began to murmur, their curiosity piqued by the sudden turn of events. The tension was unbearable, and yet the real question lingered in the air. How would he handle this now that he knew the truth? Would he own up to his error, or would his pride drive him to double down on his poor judgment? The officer's eyes darted nervously between the badge and Marissa's face. He still hadn't fully processed what was happening, as if seeing a black woman holding a badge had shattered his entire world view. His hands were shaking now, and he could feel the stares of the growing crowd on his back. Marissa stood there, still as stone, not saying a word, just watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. Every second felt like an eternity, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken words. You're with internal affairs," he finally mumbled, his voice betraying a mix of fear and confusion. Marissa's lips barely twitched in response. She could see the panic starting to bubble beneath his forced calm. She knew the stakes. His career was on the line, and he could feel the walls closing in around him. Around them, whispers grew louder. People were pulling out their phones, capturing the scene unfolding before them. Some were shaking their heads. Others had their eyes locked on the officer with a mix of disbelief and judgment. Marissa could hear one voice rising above the rest, a woman in the crowd, loud and cutting. "You think just because she's black, she's guilty. You need to be fired." The officer's gaze flickered toward the crowd, but he quickly turned back to Marissa, his posture defensive. The sweat on his forehead glistened under the harsh afternoon sun. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice faltering. Marissa could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had worked hard for her position. Every bit of respect she had earned was hard-fought. But now the officer's pride, his fragile sense of authority, was at stake. The truth was clear to everyone watching, but the question remained: would he admit it, or would he double down, risking everything to cover up his mistake? Marissa could almost hear his internal struggle as the air thickened with tension. She knew she couldn't just walk away, not without making sure this moment would count. But how much further could she push him before he snapped? What would he do next? Just as Marissa prepared to speak, her phone buzzed in her pocket, its ringtone cutting through the tense silence. She glanced at it quickly, her eyes narrowing when she saw the incoming alert. A message from her partner. It was a single line, *case here. Be careful. *. Her heart skipped a beat. The officer's anxiety seemed to intensify in that moment, but Marissa's focus shifted. She knew exactly what that message meant. It wasn't just this officer anymore. There was a much bigger threat looming over them. Her eyes flickered. Just as the man reached her, Marissa was ready to act, but the officer beside her moved faster. In a split second, he pulled out his gun, pointing it directly at her. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. His other hand fumbled with his radio, calling for backup once more. Marissa didn't flinch. She knew he was afraid, and now she could see it in his eyes. This wasn't just a poor judgment call. He was terrified of being exposed. The man, still advancing, didn't hesitate. He grabbed the officer's arm, twisting it painfully until the gun fell from his hand. The crowd gasped as chaos erupted around them. Marissa stepped forward, her heart pounding. She knew this wasn't going to end well, but she had no idea how bad it would get. "Get on the ground." The man growled at the officer, who was now kneeling, his face pale with panic. For a moment, it seemed like he would comply. But then the unexpected happened. The officer pulled something from his jacket, something small and metallic. A second gun. A backup. Before Marissa could react, the man fired, but it wasn't aimed at her. The bullet hit the officer square in the chest, and he crumpled to the ground with a sickening thud. The park erupted in chaos. Screams echoed through the air as people scattered, their phones still recording the scene unfolding before them. Marissa froze for a moment, shock washing over her. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The officer, the man who had wrongfully arrested her, was dead. And the man responsible for the shot was still standing there, his eyes locked on her, his breathing steady. For the briefest moment, Marissa thought she might be next. But instead, the man's gaze shifted past her, towards the approaching squad cars. The backup he had called for earlier was already on its way. In the confusion, he had failed to notice they had arrived. As the sirens grew louder, the man's demeanor shifted once again. His confidence faltered. Marissa saw him reach into his coat pocket and pull out a flash drive, slipping it into his palm. He was about to make a run for it. But then everything went black. A sudden flash of bright light blinded her, and the air was filled with the shrill sound of a helicopter overhead. She hadn't even realized it, but a tactical team had already set up a perimeter. It was over. The man dropped to the ground as multiple officers tackled him to the pavement. The flash drive, now exposed, was no longer a secret. Marissa didn't need to see the contents to know it held something incriminating. As she stood there, watching the chaos settle into controlled chaos, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The officer had died, but the corruption ran deeper than either of them could have imagined. And though the immediate danger had passed, the question remained: how many more were there like him, and how far did it go? In the end, she hadn't just exposed one racist cop. She'd uncovered a web of lies that reached far beyond the park, far beyond the city. In the days that followed, the news of the park confrontation spread like wildfire. What had started as a routine encounter turned into a powerful symbol of accountability. The corrupt officer's death triggered a full investigation, but it wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about a system that needed to be overhauled. The flash drive, recovered from the suspect, revealed files that implicated several high-ranking officers in a wide-reaching corruption ring. Marissa's involvement in the case became public,